Anyway, we're back, and it's COMP3026, Web Application Security Programming, and or Application Security Programming. And what we're talking about here is views today, and we're going to mention that, again, ViewBag, this whole idea of ViewBag, is almost like a container class that allows us to pass information from one page to the other. If you notice, once you see stuff like Jumbotron and things like that, you know that MVC 5 is using Bootstrap as its front end by default. Okay, so that's one thing that we're doing. Now, you might be tempted, and you'd be forgiven to think that you might be tempted to start off your MVC project from scratch. And if I was to go back over to Visual Studio here, and if I was going to start off a project, why don't you guys follow me on this so you see what I'm talking about, right? I'm sorry I can't make it any darker to give you a better contrast. And I know sitting in the audience is a lot different than actually doing it, but that window is probably the worst window that exists. I'm not sure why it is that way. If we could block that window, we'd have much better contrast in the screen. Well, you know how it is. Just health and safety concerns. But anyways, let us go into new project for a second. So if I was going to do a new project, and again, I set up a little differently than Jean-Luc did. Again, if you click on Visual C#, you can see that ASP.NET Web application is what you want to hit. Again, you can get that with Web. And again, I've got a bunch of templates that I've installed other extensions and packages. That's why you see different things from me. Now, if I go in ASP.NET Web application, I can mention this as whatever I want. And I'm going to talk about this COMP3026, and it's going to be Lesson 5, Part 1 that I'm going to be handling. We'll create a GitHub kind of repository as well. There are different templates you can use, and again, we've been using the MVC template, right? And again, you'd be forgiven to think that you can probably create it from the empty template. I'll tell you right now, using MVC5 and creating it from the empty template, it's a lot of work to get it going. And the reason why is because there's a lot of piece parts to the template that you have to put in place in order for you to have MVC5 capabilities, right? Why? You need several different folders. There's all kinds of configuration files that are just given to you right off from the scaffold. So in more ways than one, if I was going to start off a web forms application, if I was going to do this, I could start here at the empty template and work my way up. But if I'm doing a web API, like Jean-Luc was just talking about, or if I'm going to do MVC5, I'm starting off with the scaffold. And it's easier for me to delete. And actually, Kevin brought that up last time when he was doing an MVC presentation. It's easier for us to delete and remove things than for us to build it up, believe it or not. Let's take a look at that. So I'm going to start off with this MVC. Now, when you click MVC, there's some options. For example, you can go to change authentication, and I can change it from individual user accounts, like logging in, to no authentication, and it'll remove that piece. Let's do that. So let's say no authentication for this one. I'm going to press OK. All right? And then I'm going to press OK again. Now, I could host it in the cloud right here. We'll do afterwards. So now it's going through its scaffolding process, this typical scaffolding process that you get when you create your MVC5 application. And the thing that you're seeing right here, normally you see this little web page that comes up. This actually it comes right from the README file. This is right here. So if you take a look at the README file right here, if you want to create your own or modify it, it's just actually an HTML file, right, that allows you to basically go in and with some built-in styles and everything else that tells you almost like a little, this is my document. Actually, it reminds me a lot of the markdown files we see on GitHub. That's what this is. So this kind of describes your application. That's what it's for, right? I do see a lot of people are using this, especially if you're from a templating perspective. I can also see uses for this in the industry if you're going to share templates with other people in your organization. Okay, so again, we looked at the basic structure, and Jean-Luc just basically said that. We have different things. We have the content folder, just as a recap from last time, is your styles folder. Your site.css exists there. Your bootstrap CSS exists there. Your scripts folder is generated, and it has all the library scripts for your application. Funny enough, we do use jQuery and Bootstrap for the front end, and that's why you need this scripts library. Now, right now, if you notice, the models area here is blank, right? And you know what? Even though we're not going to cover models today, I'd like you to, let's create a models class today for the first time so we can talk about it, right? We're going to cover models next week, but in order for me to do a full view demo, I want to cover, making a model class. Let's do that. So I'm going to kind of right-click on models. Let's do it together, right? I'm going to click Add, and I'm going to go to Class. And I see some of you are not following. I highly recommend you follow me because this is going to be more challenging if you do it alone. Okay, from a class perspective, you want to name the model, right? So let's say we want to call this whatever the model is called. If we want to, and usually it relates to the type of database we're building, right? So let's say the database we're using is a student database, which is kind of the most common one, right? Or an example. Or maybe I like the one that actually lynda.com talks about, which is this tour of California, right? So if we're going to build a tours database, right, and there's some really good examples online for doing this, but let's use that one. So I'm going to say the database is going to be called tours, right? I have a basic class, a tours class, right? And my tours class, there's different kinds of criteria for the tours. You have the tour name, right? When we build up our database, you're going to have maybe a rating for the tour, so how difficult it is, right? You're going to have a location for the tour, right? And maybe is there food? Does it include food or not? And maybe the cost. So all these kind of things. So in order for us to build this class out, I'm going to create some properties. Now the fast shortcut for building properties out in classes is just kind of put in prop, tab. It kind of creates your property off the cuff. It's a very neat shortcut. And of course, it's going to be a string for one of my properties, which is the name of my tour, right? You know what? I also missed something. I probably want to put in, as a property, an integer value that's going to be the tour ID. So I'm going to just call it ID. Right? Because that's, if I'm building on my database, I might as well do it this way. Prop, again, prop, and then tab. And then maybe a description of my tour. So what is it like? You know, you're going to tour Ontario. And then Ontario's got some great tours. You're going to go to Aurelia, right? Because they've got some good stuff to see out there, right, Aaron?
No, they don't.
Nothing to see up in Aurelia, no. Right? How about Blue Mountain? Blue Mountain. You're going to tour Blue Mountain, right? It's only blue from here, right? It blows, in other words. Okay, let me go to another property, and so we got some maybe a decimal for the cost of the tour, right? I like that. So different kind of properties. We're creating our class, and finally. Does it include food? So again, a property that's a Boolean, right? So I'm going to hit all these ones. Oops, Boolean. That is kind of includes food, right? Now, if you notice, the default getter and setter, these are all properties. They're not instance variables. They're all generated with the get and set keywords. So if you want a default property, this is the way to do it. Right? Prop, tab, and like that. Now you can also modify each of the getters and setters if you want custom getters and setters, especially from a data validation perspective on the back end, if you want to do that. Right? Who remembers this kind of stuff? When you guys did C# with, what is it, Andrew? Some of you guys did it with me, right? We kind of scratched the surface of classes in this way because we used Windows forms to kind of capture that kind of stuff, right? In COMP3026. But this is really, in a nutshell, we're creating stuff. Is there anything else I'm missing? So we got a string, maybe a rating. And I think that's one thing we missed. So decimal, a cost, and maybe another property, you know, a tour rating, how good, you know, how difficult it is. Or maybe instead of rating, we'll call it difficulty, right? A difficulty for the tour. Is it difficult to do it? Like, is it something that takes a lot of energy to do? Is it an easy tour to do? Is it a hard thing to do? Is it some kind of it depends on what you want to put in there. All right? All right, so we got our tours model, and I'm going to save this thing. So this is our class, right? We need this tours model because you know what? We're going to, when we scaffold out our views, right, we need a model, right? Now, we don't have any data in the model right now. We don't have any connection for the model, but this is one of the ways, and by the way, we're going to be exploring the entity framework, right? I know we talked about entity framework. But we first create a model, and then from there we can create a detailed view. Yes?
If you make those private, does that mean getters and setters are private, or are they automatically public?
You want to do properties and private instance variables. That's the best practices. So public properties, private instance variables, private methods if you can, right, for certain methods, and only expose the stuff in your classes that you want to expose to the outside world, right? So public is the right access modifier. Okay, so we've got our database. Now, we want to create, of course, a controller, right? Because we talked about controllers last time. We've got our home controller. Remember last time what the home controller does? Let's take a look. It creates several different routes. So this is our index route, our about route, our contact route. These are different routes that come in stock from the home controller. You can add others. An example of that would be if I want to add a new view. Let's start with this. I'm looking at my home controller now. I've got my home, about, and contact. And if I want something else, right, in my home controller, then I could, like for example, let's say I need something about projects or something like that. If I want to get a projects view or some kind of other information that I want on here, I could simply add an additional action, and this action I can actually put in place so that it does something and actually sets up a view. How do I do that? Well, the easiest way is to create a new controller. So let's do that. So we're going to have a new controller called a tour controller. So we want to be able to look at our tours, right? We're going to say an MVC controller, right? And if you notice, if I say MVC controller with read-write actions, this might be the right way to do it. Actually, it'll add additional default actions built in. If I go with the empty controller, right, it'll just give me a blank controller with nothing inside of it, almost like a blank class. Why would I do that if I can scaffold out a read-write controller from the get-go? Let me tell you we'll show you what that looks like. So I'm going to click Add, and I'm going to now the name controller. Remember from last time we got together, the name controller must be, from an MVC perspective, inside the name of your controller. You have to have controller in the name. You can call it whatever else you like. For us, it makes sense to call this tour controller. I'm going to say click Add, do the scaffolding, and if you notice, here are the read and write properties that are built in. So we have an index, right? I have my details. I have my create. Two create methods. One, right, that uses the get, and one that uses the post, right? Okay, this is kind of neat. If I want to create my index view, and if you notice, right here from a views perspective, all we have is we have a tour folder, right? But the tour folder is empty. Right? If we want to create views for our tour folder, the easiest way to do this after you've scaffolded out your controller is right-click on index. Right? So I'm going to right-click, and then add view. Now it's going to ask me some basic questions. Here's my view name, index. My template is empty without a model because our view for our right now for our template, if I want to go in there, I'm going to probably have some information about views and how to access views. I might have some kind of navigation scheme to look at my tours and so on, right? I'm going to build that out on my own. If I wanted to link it to a model, I could, right? And I could base it off of a different kind of model, different kinds of templating that it comes stock with it. For example, a create, a delete, a details, or whatever. In this particular case, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have a model that's linked to it. I'm just going to make it empty. I could also make this as a partial view, but I don't recommend that, right? Because it creates a different kind of scaffold for us. Let's just add it and see what we get. All right, so this is what we get. We get a indexed a CS_HTML, and the CS_HTML, remember, it is in fact a partial, and we're basing it off of our basic page, all right, that we're going to see. I'm going to talk about Razor in a bit. Our default pages that we get for our templating engine, I'm going to look at afterwards. But if you notice right away, what it does is inside the tour folder, in the views folder, so down a level or so, we've got this index.CS_HTML. And if I wanted to put something in here, for example, I want to say, just to show that we're going to get there, I want to put tours index, right, just to show that that's going to work. And if I run my code here, for example, how do I get there? Well, I'm going to go to tour. I'm just running that particular thing. I'm going to go to tours index. Now, I don't have a navigation scheme to get there right now, but if you notice, from the get-go, it gives me this view, right? So again, I started with my controller. That's why we started with controllers last week. Start with your controller, scaffold out the actions that you want, because that's what each of those methods are. They're actions, right? And then from there, you can create your views. That's number one. That's the way to do it, right? Okay. So again, I have an about page. This is going back to my home about, my home controller. If you notice, home is the first word here. And the way it works is this. Your folder name or your controller name and then the action. That's how it usually works. And like Jean-Luc said, the template is home, action, and then ID. In this particular case, we don't have an ID. So we have, if I put something in here like about and I go /1, right? Then when you go in here, because we don't have an action for that, we don't have an about action that has an ID as part of its method call, right? Then it's going to take you to the general about action, which is just showing this page. Okay? Very, very straightforward. So let's go back in here. So I've got my, there's not much in here. And if you notice, my view bag in turn kind of includes my title, which is index. And I can change this title to whatever I want. In this particular case, right now it's just saying my title is index, but I can make this so it's my title is tours index. And that's the title that's going to appear right at the top of my page. So let me just run that thing again, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So here's my tour index, and if you notice up here, tours index. And if you notice, it also gives me this my ASP.NET web application. We're going to look and see where that is, because that's stored in the template. Okay, so this is an example. I want to do the same thing for now, but I want to scaffold out my creation. I want to create, right, my tour for the very first time, and I want to store it, right? So again, let's do the same thing. If I was going to leave it as is, right, without making any changes, I'm going to right-click on my create method or action, and I'm going to go to, if you notice, add to view is clicked off because I haven't stopped debugging. Let's try stopping debugging time. I'm going to add view, and when I click add view, now it asks me, here's my view name is create, and I can choose the create template. Now this is cool, guys, if you want to take a look, right? It asked me for my model class. I made a model class. And I'm going to choose tours as part of my class that I want to use, right? Now remember, tours is just a class that details different properties for my tour, right? I also want to click this on as well, reference script libraries, if there's any, all right? And I want to click add. It scaffolds out this, right, in 2 seconds, as you saw. Let's run this thing, and so I can show you what this looks like. So I'm going to run this. So here's my create. Take a look what it gives me. And again, this took 2 seconds to do. A full form on how to create a tour, right? If you notice, it knows two things. Automatically, it knows that I don't need to sculpt out my ID. My ID, it knows it's an ID I'm going to use for my database, right? It knows that, you know what, I want a checkbox for includes food or not, right? And if you notice right here, from a difficulty perspective, there is no validation, but I can change that. Okay, I can change all this this different stuff. For example, my description says description, difficulty says difficulty, and includes food here, right? As an example, it shows me one word. I can change all this, and I can do that in the model, which is very interesting. Okay, again, we're not talking models today. I'm using a model. I've created a class to scaffold a view, right? And the view itself is generated from the details of my model. I see it's a create method, right, as an example, and it's using the tours model as my name, create tours, right? Now, that doesn't do anything right now. If I actually go through here and type in the name of the tour, like, you know, tour Ontario, right? And then description, you know, tour beautiful Ontario, right? Especially Aurelia. Right? Let's just say, right? And the difficulty we'll say is easy because it's not that difficult to tour Aurelia, right? And the cost is about, you know, I'm trying to put in some values here, $4,000, right? And if you notice, it gives me, I know it's what it is, but what it does automatically, it says, hey, you're listening for a decimal and you're giving me some kind of details that I don't need. So it says field cost must be a number. So I can add in there, you know, 4,000 as a number. That would work. I can also click on, well, it includes food or it doesn't. And if I click create, it'll take me back to the default tours index.
I'm paying $4,000 to go to Aurelia. Better damn well.
4,000 includes food.
You have to pay me $4,000 to go to Aurelia.
Come on, right? So here's where it gets interesting. Again, my view bag title. This is the view bag is just a again a container that I can add anything I want. Right now it's called create, and you know what? Maybe what I want to do is I want to create tours, even though it says create and tours afterwards. Create my tour. Create a new tour. Right? And if you notice, all this validation and everything else for the form is created automatically, and it's also compatible right away with Bootstrap. It kind of scaffolds out a Bootstrap view automatically for you. That's awesome. Like, that's a lot of work that we don't have to do, right? And it did it in a few clicks. Okay, cool. So we're going to save this thing. So I've shown you this. I've shown you the tour controller and everything else. But let's go back into that tours model for a second, right? Yep.
Just to interrupt on that, can you still add validation by clicking the toolbox and then dragging it over?
You can do all that kind of stuff. You can do all kinds of stuff, but the right way to do it is to do it in here, as you're going to see in a second, right? So in here is where you want to add filters, right, that allow you to do things like display name and so on. But you have to turn another using statement on. Let's go back to the PowerPoint for a second to make sure we've covered everything. So again, from a view basics perspective, there's a couple things. If you look at this basic website, and this is the basic one that comes with the home page, it has this view bag. It has, again, some basic scaffolding that gives you your default Bootstrap site. Okay, that's what it's giving you. And some information in terms of how to make use of this site. Okay. What we've done, again, is once we have this action result, right, we can override the view bag. View bag has limitations. You can only send certain things onto inside the view bag. I mean, I can add other things, like, for example, view bag message your application description page, whatever the application is, for your view in your about. I can add other properties, like I said, on the fly, right? And here's some examples of that. Here's my view bag title is my about, and my view bag.title I can put into my h2 tag, and then there's an h3 tag that I can put my view bag.message, right? So I can put all this stuff in there depending on what I want to put, and I can put that in from on the controller side. So the controller, that back end stuff on the CS file, will send information to the view any way I like it. Okay, but again, and it does it from the server side. Again, think about this. Right now we're putting in static files, static strings, but you can connect it to a database, like an entity framework type of database. You can use the entity framework to access a SQL database, as an example, through your views and on your controller side. Okay. Just going to go to the next page. So connect to map, right? And again, when you create a view, like it says, this project template, you'll notice that the project contains views, and that's what we just did now. We just created an additional view. Once we created our new model, we create a view based on what the model is giving us. So first we create a controller. The next step is to create our model, and after that we can scaffold out our views. Even though we haven't talked about what models are until next week, if we get together next week, the idea here is that the controller basically, kind of sets up your actions, and the actions are almost like a response to routes. That's what they are. That's what basically they are. If I was going to convert them or translate them for you, and then when you right-click on your action, you can scaffold out your view based on the action. That includes things like any kind of parameters that's going to be passed into the view from your action. Okay, and we'll get into that. Here's something that you can do. If you want to supply a name to your view, an example is I'm returning a view, but I'm passing in this name, and this string is called not index, right? So this is the view name that's going to come out, right? So instead of it being index, not index will be the way that the route responds, right, to what you're listening for. Let's check that out and see how that works. Let's go back to our basic stuff. So I'm going to go back to my tour controller, right? And when I say create, maybe what I want to make to customize this thing, right? And what's the easiest way to do this is, of course I've got to stop debugging. I can pass in there the route that I wanted to listen for, which is create tour, right? So instead of it listening for create, it's going to listen now to create tour, right? And that's what the route's going to be. It's still going to follow the create logic, right? But it's going to listen for create tour. And if you notice what I'm returning here, I got to do the same thing here because I've got two different method calls, right? One that's a get request and one that's a post request. I've got to have both of those things kind of, configured the same way. Okay, let's take a look at that. So I'm going to run this thing. It's going to take me to my default screen. And if I just do /tour/create by itself, right, it gives me this now, right? Because there is no create route anymore. But if I go create tour, create tour, come on, Tom, and it still gives me an error, right? Just perfect, exactly what I wanted. Not. And the reason for that is because I haven't configured this inside my, it automatically configures a tour name inside of my config file, and I can change that later on. But as you can see, at least it responded. It says, hey, I got it. I don't know what to do with this thing yet, right? But I know that this one I know about, this create tour kind of route, but I don't know anything about create. Create doesn't exist. It gives me the server error. And this is the kind of server errors John was talking about. John was saying, hey, don't respond with server errors like this. If you have a 404 page, say it's 404, not, page not found. Don't respond with a bunch of this stuff because this is giving us information about the type of system that we're using. Okay, and if you notice, the view create tour or its master was not found, or view engine supports the search locations. This is kind of a really detailed kind of explanation as to what we're listening for. Take a look, tour, create tour, and then you notice that there is none of that exists, and that's why we're getting that error. An example of that would be if I went here and left it the way it is. If I right-click on this object again, first I got to stop debugging. And if I right-click on this again and I say Add View, it's going to still give me a create, and I can create additional views based on the model. Now the challenge is it's going to give me the same name, create, right? If I wanted to create a new name, right, as an example, create tour, I can create a view based on this particular change that I made. Let's add that in. Here's my create tour, right? And I'm going to say create tour. And let's go back into my website and run it again. Because I didn't have a view before at all in any kind of way. And if you notice now, I'm still getting this issue because my routes aren't correct. They're incorrect on the inside, right? On the positive, if I go here, I'm still going to get this, right? Take a look. Here's my create tour because I've got my create, right? And it has a path to go to now, right? It goes to my new view, create tour, right? But my create tour path, my create tour, if I go put create tour in there, it doesn't know what that is, right? So what am I doing? If I go back and if I go into index.html, into my create, my tour controller, I've got two different paths, and all I'm doing is I'm saying my view, I'm naming create tour. That's my view, right? My view, the new name for my view, instead of it being create, I can make it whatever I want. So from a routing perspective, it's going to route to this create tour view as opposed to the create view, right? And you can make it route to whatever view you want. If I take this away, as an example, when I stop debugging, and again, I can make each of these go to different views as well. That's the other power. If I have a GET request, I can send it to the regular tour, and if I have a post request, it'll go somewhere else, to a different kind of view altogether. And that's some good flexibility there. Let's try this out. Back to where it was. And again, I'm going to go to tour create, and now it's going to go back to create, right? Because it knows how to do that. Right? When I scaffolded out the other create method, the tour create method, or the view, my view, and if I look under tour, there's two, right? There's create and create tour. Create tour has nothing inside of it. It's not connected to a model, whereas my create method is connected to a model. It has some interesting scaffolding inside of there. Okay, let me get rid of this. I don't need it. It was just an example of how we use that. Stop debugging. Stop debugging, Tom. I know. It's crazy. All right, so we can do that. That's one action we can take with this one. Here's a more complicated action. If you want to kind of target a full path, you can use this as well. One of the things to note, not just for ASP.NET MVC5, but also for ASP.NET Web Forms, the tilde, or the tilde character, allows us to go back up to root, and then from there allows us to go drill down into the folder that we want. This is a good methodology because sometimes some frameworks will stop you from drilling up, like to actually traverse your website. It doesn't allow you to do that, right? So you'll get some errors at times if you try and do it that way. So that's why Microsoft kind of fixes this by using the tilde character to go back out to the root, right? So you go to root, then slash, then views. This is the full path to get whatever, to do whatever you want to look at with your particular action, right? So you can customize the view path the way you like. This is an example of an action result, and this is where this talks about how ViewBag falls short, because you can add albums. If you notice, this is where the var keyword is used. And by the way, this comes right from the book, right? So here's an example of an action result called list. We're making a new list action result, and we're creating a new object or a variable called albums. It's a new list, an album list, as an example, right? And here what we're going to do is we're going to add a new album title, right? The product, whatever it is, to the list. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, albums never existed before because it's ViewBag is a static property. You can add whatever property you decide to mention into ViewBag. Suddenly, ViewBag, although it doesn't have anything to do with albums, now does. Just by simply assigning it. So if I say albums is equal to albums, the list, suddenly ViewBag has a list property that's called albums. Yeah.
So if I were to change the album on the fly, but still in the view, and like do it in code, will it automatically change it over?
No. If you reference albums somewhere else, viewbag.albums, and if it won't go through your entire code and change it. You have to go through it yourself.
Yeah.
But the great thing is, if you want to pass albums as a property into your view, you could do that. And by taking the information from, let's say, in this particular case, it would be a database. Dangerous, right? Because this is, again, you're hard coding what you're getting out of albums. Okay, I'm going to keep going. And this talks about some other methodologies here about how to do things in a different way, which I'm not going to do right now. I want to get into filtering, right? Because I think that's the kind of neat thing. And again, it talks about how ViewBag, here's another property that we added in. ViewBag current time is equal to datetime.now, right? So we've added in a new property for ViewBag called current time, and we're going to access it inside of our page. All right, I want to get into view models a little bit. Again, not too much into it because next week we're going to handle models. So here's a model, here's a class we've created. We've also created it with an IEnumerable product, right, as an example. And now what we want to do is we want to use the @model directive, right, to access the model, which is kind of a neat thing to do, right? I'm going to add the view by right-clicking and adding the view in there, like we showed you earlier. And I'm just going to make sure that we get to that right place. I want to show you this right here. Okay, so here's some scaffold types. When you add in the view, you can do a create, which creates the view, a delete, which actually does all your CRUD operations. You can actually scaffold out. As long as you have a model and you have a database, you can create your forms, if you will, off the fly. That's like, so again, right-click, add view, you link it to a model, and away you go. So it's really, really powerful, like stuff that you can scaffold out on your own. In fact, I like it a lot better, I'll be honest with you, because I've been working with Node over the last little while. And if you want to scaffold a Node module, let's say with Yeoman or something like that, this is a little easier, right? And that's the power of Visual Studio. Visual Studio has a lot of intelligence, a lot of help, and that's why Enterprise tends to use that for now instead of using something like Node, which is still, in my opinion, in its infancy. Let's wait for Node to be around for as long as MVC has been around from a ASP.NET perspective, and let's see where it's going. Maybe in the future everyone will be using Node. But for now, stuff like this, and not just with ASP.NET MVC, but also with Java and other things, that you get this kind of support with these kind of platforms. So what the hell is Razor anyway? We've talked about these views, and you notice that they're partials. You don't have a full HTML page when I create a view. I have a view bag that's inside of a little, some curly braces and all that kind of stuff. But we don't have the scaffold itself, the template. We haven't seen that yet. And Razor, basically, this Razor view engine is a templating engine and has replaced, or they're trying to replace, the old web forms view engine. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. So here, as an example, this is an example of a web page, and you've got this @ directive, and inside of here, these items, anything inside between these braces, after the @ directive, you can put any kind of C# code that you want. And Razor's smart enough to switch back between C# code and HTML over and over again. It's very similar. It reminds me a lot of when we did work on Express. I don't know if you guys did any kind of work with Express in Node, right? The idea for you to switch back, and when I say Express, I'm looking at the EJS templating engine, not the Jade templating engine. If you guys know about that, right? Jade is a different kind of look, but when you use Express, it looks very similar to this actually, where you're able to use some kind of directive or an expression, and anything inside the body of that expression, you can use pure C# code and allow you to switch back and forth. Here's an example of that. You've got C# code in here, so I'm declaring item. It's a new string array, as an example, 1, 2, 3. That's C# code. Then you're into HTML type code, then back into C# code that's after the for each, right? And it allows you to go back and forth. The great thing is, if you don't want to confuse the engine, you want to use parentheses to do that. So if you're going to go move between typical HTML code markup and back into C# and you're using the @, especially when you're doing something like putting together an email address, as an example, you don't want to confuse the engine. You want to put parentheses around that, and so it'll try to interpret this @ sign. Yeah. Why do we do it on the Node side? Why do we do it?
No, I don't like it with them. I've never templated in Express.
Well,
I would serve
there's
service or an API that serves the data, and then you could template on the client.
there's arguments for both sides. Like for example, we're going to move into the point where later on in the course we're going to do Angular with MVC, right? And you're going to see that you want to use one or the other. You don't have to use the Razor templating engine at all. You don't have to use this. But this is very common when you look. So I got to talk about it, the MVC framework, and a lot of people what they use is it's easier for them to do it on the back end, right, than do it on the front end. Because on the front end, I mean, again, we're doing MVC, but MVC is supported on the server side, right? Not on the front end, like we're used to with Angular, right? Angular is the front end framework, right? That uses MVC and partials, right? Express on the Node side, right? Node Express, that whole part of the mean stack, and Razor and ASP.NET Web Forms is all happening on the back end, right? It's a very popular way of doing things. Even Java does it the same way. I agree with you. I agree. I think that templating should all be done on the front end. It's more model views. That's what they're talking about here. It's more model views than true MVC. So model view controller, right? That kind of thing, right? And if you talk about that to Microsoft people, they're like, no, it's not true. It's true MVC. But in fact, what we're doing is it's actually a model view controller, MVVC, right? MVVMC.
If you wanted to make like a mobile application the same backend, you have to rewrite all your views. You couldn't just package the same backend.
You could use the same views. You'd have to make new views. You have to make new views, correct? Yeah. But you're using Bootstrap, so that's where they get around is they use a front end framework that's responsive to get around that. So, but if you were going to write, let's say, a true mobile site, like let's say with Ratchet or jQuery Mobile, for God's sake, right? I'm just saying, right? Yes, you'd have to write new views altogether, right? If it was purely for mobile. Okay, thanks for that derailment. Let's continue. I like it. I like it though. I like the conversation. I want to get to this piece where here's an example again of, we've got this, an example of my string. It's called root namespace and my app. And what we're doing is in a span, we're saying again, I'm surrounding my my C# code, right? So at root namespace.models, which is right here, right? What we're doing is we're surrounding this with a span tag. So as you can see, it's flexible enough to go between, you know, this directive back, you know, through into the HTML markup and then back into a directive. That's what this allows you to do, and that's why people love it. They love Razor because it's so flexible, going back and forth. Yes, it's not, you know, a front end type of MVC. It's a back end type of MVC, model view controller kind of thing. I know you said MVVM. They call it MVVC, right? But MVVMC, sure. But at the end of the day, that's what they do. So they go from, so this is a way to solve it. Example, if you wanted to use, when we use parentheses, you can isolate the namespace from the models, and this would work a little bit better. So you're going to see that. So if we go back to the code, and if I look at our template, which if you look under shared, so let's take a look at your folder name again. Under shared, you have something called layout.cshtml. This is your template, if you will, for your entire site. So here's an example of that, right? This is where you actually see your HTML that's going to be used by your site. And here's an example of that. Take a look at this. For your layout, you have home, about, and contact. And if you notice, this piece here is kind of the name of your site. This is the action that you're going to take, and then finally, this is the string that you're going to use. If I was to set up another controller like this, let's say if I would create another list item, right? And I want to put this inside of my in my navbar, right? So I'm going to put action link. Thank God it gives me IntelliSense. So I've got a bunch of different options here. So if you notice, one of the options is my string link text, right? And then my string action name. Well, that's not the one I'm doing, right? I've got that three-piece, right? So I have string link text, my string action name, and then my object, my root value, home, home, home. If you notice, it's the home controller that I'm hitting, right? So let's say I want to create another one. Instead of just contact and about, I want to make something called projects. I don't have that right now, right? And the middle one, of course, is my action name. So I want to call it projects. I don't have that action right now. And it's under my home controller. Now I can make it so that it's any controller I want. For example, more practical thing would be tours, right? So here's tours, right? And then it would be my index for my tours, right? And then it would be part of my tour controller. Right, makes sense? So let's take a look and see what that does. If I run this thing now, right, just by modifying my page, I should see a link to my tours, right? So that's the way we scaffold it out. So the actual CSHTML file, the layout, the CSHTML file, creates our site-wide navigation, creates our common consistent look and feel for the site. When we click on tours now, it takes us to our tours index right away. Right? So can you do that all at the inside of your layout? And if you look here, you've got a lot of these directives. At HTML.actionLink, right, is a directive that takes the HTML class and the ActionLink method and actually creates a link from the C# code. That's what it's doing. And this is the way to do it when you use the Razor View Engine to create your links. Okay, it's not like ASP.NET where you have those funny carrots or the crocodile, I know people say that, the crocodile parentheses and so on. Here's something else. If you notice, there's render body. Here's my content body. Here's my render body. And this render body directive is the thing that we use in each of our views. So our views automatically kind of instantiate this render body method, and anything that's inside of our view gets kind of passed into here, right? And if you notice, our footer includes this date time function, and then here's my ASP.NET application. I want to take that out. Maybe I'm going to call this my custom app, right? This is in our again, we're doing this inside of our application. And anything else in here. For example, my view bag title, maybe I don't want to have my ASP.NET application. I want to, whatever my app is called, so my custom app, whatever my app is called. And my instead of my Tom, not MH. There we go. So again, when I go to, if I run this thing, if I refresh this thing, right, and I go back out into my my application, right, it's going to say home, my custom application, right? My application name should say my application. I didn't do that. If I go to tours, it's going to also give my tours index, my custom application name, my custom app, right? And here I want to change that. Of course, we know that that's in the branding section of our template. Just got to find that piece, which is right application name. Right here it is. So again, it's the same kind of idea. Here's my action link. Application name is the link text. So instead of application name, it's going to be my custom application, my custom app. Right there it is. And this is the branding text that I'm going to put in on the left hand side of my screen. Let's take a look. Let's refresh that one. There it is, my custom app, right? So I can modify my views like that. So that's the templating engine is very similar to any templating engine you've ever seen. The only difference is that, and if again, who's not good with templating engines? Who doesn't know about templating engines? Please put up your hand now, because if you don't know templating engines by now, at this stage, it's something that you need to discover and learn about, because they're being used everywhere. Luckily, we're using Bootstrap here, so it gives us that, to answer Aaron's response, it gives us that responsive design. It doesn't do a mobile-first framework, and you would have to create additional views to suffer that. Like, for example, if you're listening, no, it's a great example actually, because you would have to create additional views, but it does work the same way. I mean, in my opinion, if you're doing any kind of scaffolding, and if you're using an MVC of any kind, you should really decide one way or the other. Are you going to do it on the front end? Are your views going to be on the front end, or are your views going to be on the back end? You don't want to use Express and Angular to do your partials. That's crazy, as an example. In the same way, you don't want to use Angular and MVC5 to do your views. You're not going to use the Razor engine and the AngularJS kind of MVC framework to do that.
Even if you were doing it all on the back end, I just would like a little more separation between the two components.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I agree with you. That's really it in a nutshell for views. I wanted you to understand how to generate views. I think what we're going to do is, if you look at the PowerPoint presentation that I put up online as well, it talks about different ways of injecting C# code alongside your views to make them more dynamic. I think what I want to get to next week, and this is an example of the old framework, the old web forms view engine, right here, and this is what it would look like in our new Razor view engine. So it's almost the identical kind of idea. The functionality is there. It's just our syntax is slightly different. Where I want to get to next week is when we start doing things like not just the layouts and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I've covered most of the stuff that I want you to look at. I want to talk about models next week, and I also want to give you your first assignment. So assignment number 1, which will be 20% of your final mark, right? Again, what I'm probably going to get you to build is a very, very simple e-commerce site. And don't get me wrong, we're going to be using MVC5 to do it, right? And we're going to talk about models, right? So you're going to have a model to go with, right? And when I say a very, very simple e-commerce site, I'm talking about few products, not a lot of products. Imagine if you have a customer and he doesn't have a lot of products. He has like 10 products, right? How would you sell these products? How would you create all the piece parts you need for your e-commerce site? Well, that's most likely what your first assignment is going to be around. It's going to be worth 20%, and it's going to be an option you can work on your own or with somebody else. Okay. Other than that, that's it for me for this week. I wanted to give you a kind of a high-level idea about how views work, and there's the PowerPoint presentation is a really good reference card for you to talk about the Razor view engine, which we're going to go into more detail over the next few weeks.